It's been said that every quilt tells a story, and it's so true. But I also believe every quilter has a story to tell. I wanted to hear about the people behind these wonderful quilts and thought you'd enjoy hearing about their lives also. Welcome to A Quilter's Life. Bea Byrne is a quilter, artist, and entrepreneur living in Oakland, California. She has a love of anything to do with textiles, but her real passion is quilting. After a career in tech and events, Bea realized that organizing and hosting an online conference would be the perfect way to merge the two worlds. She has created the Quilt and Learn events, which include teachers from all over the world. And if you've been listening to A Quilter's Life for a while, you may even recognize some of the teachers at this event. Bea, thank you for joining us on A Quilter's Life.
Thank you so much for having me.
Glad you're here. How did you find out about A Quilter's Life?
So it was a friend of mine called Mel Beach who told me about it and suggested I take part. And Mel is a quilter I'm sure most people listening will be familiar with. And I probably first met her a few years after coming to the Bay Area. And I was either about to be or was currently president of the San Francisco Quilters Guild. And she came to give a talk. And I remember it was about basically saying yes and entering challenges for, I think, a year at the time. I think she was fairly new to it all back then, but she's obviously grown by miles since then and become very well known, very respected. But yeah, I was really impressed with her from the get-go. And since then, I've done multiple workshops with her and seen her speak a number of times, and it's always fantastic.
Oh, that's great. I am so glad she shared this with you.
Yeah, me too.
Well, we'll jump back to your story. Where were you born and raised?
So I was born in Kent in the UK, which is the bottom right corner. If you're familiar with what the UK looks like, it's the bit that includes the White Cliffs of Dover. It's opposite France. Yeah, it was a seaside town, just a few miles away from the town that I eventually grew up in. Yeah, it was a very happy little place. It was also a big retirement community as well, kind of like the whole town was one big retirement community. So the age of the inhabitants tended to be stacked somewhat to the upper end, but I still had great fun and we lived in a house right opposite the beach. So it was always interesting, although it was a pebble beach and the English Channel is not known for its warmness.
Did you spend a lot of hours down along the beach?
Oh, I did. My sister and I were both born under the Cancer star sign. And so my mum would kind of joke that we were both little crabs because I would be straight into the sea and splashing about and diving down to the bottom and so on. And my sister would scuttle up and down on the shore where the water met the pebbles and be more comfortable on the land than she was in the water.
How fun. Can you share a childhood memory?
I was actually talking to a friend about this a few days ago. There were trampolines. I guess it was about a mile away from where I lived, straight down along the coast along the seashore. And there was a seawall and walkways and so on. So you could walk there easily enough. And of course, this was an era when parents didn't think much about letting a 10-year-old walk a mile by themselves in the middle of a busy summer's day. So I would go down there, I would do little jobs for my mum, 5p at a time, and it would be all of about 30p to spend about 10 minutes jumping up and down on a trampoline. The thing I was telling my friend the other day was that there were about 5 or 6 trampolines in a row on the pebble beach. The metal bars around the trampolines were all exposed. This is the early 80s. There's no padding, no health and safety. And it's kind of a miracle that any of us made it off those trampolines without skull fractures and things like that. But I absolutely loved them. And in fact, would end the summer like much fitter than I had been at the beginning when I'd just been doing like sports at school and so on, just because I'd spent so long every day jumping up and down.
I'm picturing our middle son. We had a Johnny jump for him, and he bounced so much on that when I took him out of it, he would bounce. So I am picturing after you got off those trampolines, were you still bouncing?
I must have felt like I was, yes. And I mean, this was certainly for the UK, this was hot weather sometimes as well. And there were no water bottles or anything. So I remember getting back home sometimes like very red and kind of feeble feeling, having just bounced up and down in the boiling sun and then walked the mile back in the boiling sun as well. But it was a great time. I don't regret anything. Yeah, I've just always loved bouncing on trampolines, I suppose. Although I must admit, I haven't done any for quite a while now.
Would you if you could?
I would, yes. And in fact, there were two trampoline parks. So you can see I've looked into this. There was one in San Francisco, and then there was another one in the East Bay nearby where I live now. One closed down in the pandemic, and I can't remember which one it was, but one of them was called the House of Air. And I have often looked into it, but I'm just waiting for a friend to come with me because I'm in my late 40s now. And if I go to a trampoline park full of children by myself, that's going to look very strange. And so I really need someone to come with me and bounce with me. And there just aren't that many willing volunteers out there. But it was something I kind of made a bit of a list during the pandemic of things that I really wanted to do. And that was one of them. So I definitely need to go back to that list and revisit it.
That would be fun. Well, through the years, did you have other employment besides quilting?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's only in the last 2 years that quilting and crafts have become my main source of income. I basically was one of those kids that always had a job. There wasn't a huge amount of money. We didn't lack for necessities or anything, but there wasn't a huge amount of spare money when I was growing up. And so all our clothes, well, a lot of our clothes came from thrift stores and so on. And so I was always working, whether it was like washing neighbors' cars for 50p or £1 or something. And then later I had a job in a local bookshop. That was my first proper like salaried job. And then I would do extra things in the summer. But it was after majoring in physics, I started working for the Institute of Physics, which is kind of membership, professional membership organization for physicists in the UK and internationally. And that was where I officially entered the proper workforce and started working then and worked for a couple of not-for-profit charity like membership organizations in the UK before starting on my travels around the world. And then when I ended up in the US, I was working for startups on the tech side of things, and then eventually moved to Shopify, which is another tech company, and got much more into the e-commerce and marketing side of things. But I think practically all of my jobs have included some element of planning and organization.
Now, you just touched on beginning your travels. From your website, it sounds like you've been quite a few places.
I have. I mean, I always loved traveling when I was in the UK. I very rarely traveled like on family vacations because we lived opposite the sea. It was almost like you were always at a beach house. So we didn't really travel very much when I was a child. But as soon as I turned 18, I went on a trip to Paris on my own, which I got horribly harassed the whole time by the various men of Paris. But that's what happens when you're 18 and go somewhere by yourself, I guess, or did then. And then after that, I used to love exploring Europe. And it was the age when EasyJet, and there's another one as well, when these airlines were starting up and they would do these ridiculous like return fares for £5, less than $10. And you'd have to pay extra for taxes. But if you stayed in a youth hostel, you could kind of spend 2 or 3 nights in a capital city in Europe for well under $100. So I was always off doing those kind of things. And then as I started earning more money, I would go on more elaborate trips. But it was in, I think, 2013, my husband of the time had a job offer to move to Tokyo. And he'd hit a kind of glass ceiling in London by way of opportunities. There just weren't any senior roles above him. So I found suddenly I was going to be living in Tokyo. And so I ended up being there for 14 months. And it was very strange because we lived in Tokyo, but we were always on the verge of coming back again because his job was quite tumultuous and not very stable. And so every few months, I'd say something like, oh, I really want to learn Japanese now. I think it seemed good. And then my husband would go, oh, we might be leaving next month. I'd just hold off for another month or so just to see if things settle down. And then a couple of months later, I'd be going, I really think I should learn Japanese now. It was very odd to be living in the country, but without the language. I mean, obviously, there were the basics like, hello, how are you? And, can I have some water and things like that? But it wasn't terribly two-way. And then after the job finished in Tokyo, his old company wanted him back, but there still weren't any opportunities in London. And so then they offered him a role in San Mateo, which is not far from San Francisco. And I assumed we would live in San Mateo, but my now ex-husband was adamant that we should live in San Francisco. No one wanted to live in San Mateo, he assured me. And I've since found out that many millions of people live in San Mateo, so it can't be that bad. But anyway, so yeah, we moved to San Francisco. So I'm almost exactly 10 years that I've been here now. And at the start of the pandemic in 2020, I moved to Oakland, which is just across the Bay Bridge from San Francisco. And I just really love it here. I was explaining to a friend, they were kind of asking me why I'd stayed in Oakland when my husband and I divorced and separated in 2020. So I don't have relationship ties here or family ties. And I could go anywhere, but I just love Oakland. So I think I'm going to be here for quite some time to come. And of course, in amongst all this, I've continued traveling, some within the US, Hawaii, of course, which is part of the US, but so far away. And then just last October, I went to Peru on the trip of a lifetime. So I've still definitely got the travel bug.
Oh, wow. Peru, I'm thinking, I guess it would be more Mexico, Mayan temples or something, but what was there in Peru?
Oh, absolutely. No, you're thinking along the right lines. There's a huge turning point in Peruvian history when the Spanish arrived and overturned the Incan culture that was there. I think that was in about 1500 and something. It's not like that was the culture that had been there since the start of time. There had been lots of other cultures before that. And I think the place a lot of people think of when they think of Peru is Machu Picchu, this astonishing, absolutely mind-blowing Incan temple on the top of this huge peak. And you are 7,000 feet or something up in the air. And there are clouds floating around, and it's just astonishing. But then there's also other places. The Andes range runs through Peru, and then Peru has Lake Titicaca, and then it also shares a rainforest with Bolivia. I was with a friend, and so we went all around the country and ended up in the rainforest, which was just astonishing. Seeing leafcutter ants carrying their bits of leaves on real trees, and monkeys flying around, and parrots in their natural habitat, not perched on someone's shoulder. Yeah, it was absolutely amazing. And of course, the textiles are a whole nother level. There was one fascinating thing that I keep thinking about, which is, you've probably heard of shibori, right? The Japanese indigo dyeing. And it's a resist dyeing technique. It's kind of where tie dyeing came from. You tie the fabric in different ways, and wherever the dye can't get to stays white or whatever the original color was, and everything else turns blue or whatever. But what I discovered is that technique was actually discovered, I think it was in 3 places worldwide around the same time. So the Japanese discovered it, and they're kind of known for it. But then also that part of South America discovered it. And then there was another location, which has totally got out of my head. I do have a terrible memory, but it was fascinating because I walked into this textile museum on the first day, which I'd made a point of researching and making sure I could visit. And there was this beautiful piece of silk, like shibori dyed silk. And I was like, oh, they must have been trading with Japan at this time. And that's kind of surprising because it was quite early. But no, this was Peruvian silk and Peruvian dyed patterns. It was absolutely astonishing. Yeah, it was a fascinating trip, both culturally and textilely, and food and drinks and, oh my goodness, everything.
Oh, that sounds, like you mentioned, a trip of a lifetime. I grew up just north of you. So a lot of people up in Sonoma County would travel every day to go work in San Francisco. So when you said you didn't want to live in San Mateo, I was like, well, They live farther away than that.
I know. And of course, the pandemic made a huge difference. And San Francisco is kind of half the city it was, unfortunately. And there's all sorts of social problems now. Well, there were those problems before, but they've kind of been magnified by moving into the center of the city. But yeah, I know lots of people that are still commuting in on a daily basis. But equally, there's a lot of people who now work from home as well, or at least part of the week. So it's fascinating negotiating with people when you're going to meet up. I have a friend that lives in SF who wants to meet up. I kind of have to plan in advance which day I'm going to go there and all the different things that I want to do on that day. Like if there's an exhibition on or a particular cafe I want to try or something, then I'll need to arrange for all those to happen at once. I thought I'd be popping into San Francisco all the time from Oakland, but it turns out that that bridge really makes a big difference. So I've tended to stay this side of the bay, which is great because, of course, from a quilting perspective, poor San Francisco only has Britex Fabrics left as its fabric store, and they're not specific to quilting or anything. Whereas in the East Bay, there's a great number of quilting stores, which are great, like New Pieces. Stone Mountain and Daughters is the one that I've been going to most recently, and they've got a fabulous selection. So yes, I feel like I've landed on the right side of the bridge.
Mm-hmm. If you don't mind sharing, could you tell us about your cancer journey?
Yes, of course. There's a lot of concern amongst people who have experienced cancer that people talking to them shouldn't say the wrong thing. You're not supposed to say that you got the good kind of cancer or the easy version of cancer or something. And you're not supposed to talk about being lucky and all that sort of thing. But having said that, any kind of cancer is devastating, just as a starter. But I was so lucky that my cancer, it was breast cancer in my left breast, and it was picked up as part of a routine mammogram, which here they start automatically at 40 and then every 2 years. I had put mine off, my 42 one, because of the pandemic and was a few months late. But they still caught it really early. So kudos to Kaiser Permanente for picking it up, which is the healthcare company. They found it in the October. And of course, we were still in lockdown. And it was only because I'd had a message from Kaiser saying, don't delay essential tests, like a generic mailer kind of thing, that I'd got it done. So they detected it in October. I then had a lumpectomy the day before Thanksgiving in 2000, and then was healed and ready to start the radiation therapy that I needed at the beginning of January. So I think it was 2nd of January, maybe that in 2021, that I started the radiation. Now, of course, we're still in lockdown during all this time. And coincidentally, at the beginning of the pandemic, my marriage had fatally broken down. My ex-husband had cabin fever very badly and wasn't quarantining, wasn't handling things well. And our marriage was awful anyway. So I took the step and moved out and moved to Oakland. And coincidentally, at the same time, my boss left the company that I was working at, and I was reporting directly to them as an assistant. And so my job changed as well. So everything was changing. And I discovered then just within a few months of that I had cancer and had to go through that by myself. Although honestly, the one thing I kept thinking to myself through all my treatment was, thank goodness my marriage has already ended, because otherwise I'd have to go through this and be ending my marriage at the same time. And it would all supporting my husband or something. So yeah, it was really a blessing, even though at the time it did not feel like it. Having breast cancer, it's like being forced to sign up for a master's in a subject that you have no desire to know anything about. But there's so many different types. There's so many different treatment options. You're suddenly in conversations with people about onca tests, which kind of tests how effective it would be if you had chemotherapy and whether you need to have chemotherapy. You're talking about what skin types are most likely to burn with radiation therapy and what kind of creams and potions you can use to sort that out and all the different side effects. It's just so much information. So I was really fortunate that there were 2 local support groups who were both meeting online because of the pandemic that I could belong to. And those support groups were invaluable. They were just life-saving. And you'd be the new person for the first week or two. But then, unfortunately, the one thing you can guarantee about breast cancer is there's always more people coming after you. And so there would be new people joining. So as soon as you'd kind of got to grips with your own cancer, as much as you ever can, you would then be in a position to help the people that were only a month behind you in the same journey, but you'd be able to give them real-time feedback on what it was like to go for your first radiation session. For example, the place where I went, they give you 4 permanent tattooed dots when you have your first radiation treatment, because they want to be able to deliver the radiation so precisely that they then use these 4 permanent dots to line you up for future sessions. And I remember talking to one woman who'd just been diagnosed and she had 2 young children. It was like so hard for her, because how do you tell children that that's going on? But she was also really scared of needles and was like freaking out about the idea of having these tattoos, because you have them for the rest of your life. You know, I've still got them and everything. They're not going anywhere. And so I remember being able to talk to her and just say, you barely even realize that they're doing anything, and just reassure them that, even though I'd only just had it done like a few days previously. So yeah, the support groups were just invaluable. And you had some people that were like 10 years out of recovery and able to talk about the effect it had on them in the long term, as well as people who were currently in treatment. So yeah, that was a lot. And the radiation therapy, again, I'm lucky that I didn't need chemo, because chemo is a whole nother ball game and half kills you basically to make sure the cancer dies. But the radiation therapy in itself was very strange, and you can't ever predict exactly what the side effects are going to be, because it's different from person to person. I was absolutely fine for the first 2 or 3 weeks, and I think I had 4 weeks of treatment altogether, where you go in every weekday and get zapped. But suddenly towards the end, it was like a water jug that's not got any water in it or something. You know, I just had no energy. And it wasn't like if I rested that I would feel energy, because I just had no energy. There was just nothing there. And so for probably a year afterwards, I had to be careful, because if I exerted myself in the morning, then that was it. I was done for the day. And like I say, it doesn't matter if I go to bed and sleep, I was done, and would have to wait until I'd had a really long period to recharge over. So yeah, it was crazy. But the great thing is that I am now pretty much 4 years out, and everything is looking clear. And of course, once you've had breast cancer, they give you the mammograms annually to make sure that they're keeping an eye for any reoccurrence. I can't pretend it's not something I think about, whether it's going to reoccur. And having the annual mammograms is very stressful, but it's got less stressful over the last few years. Yeah, I'm able now to reassure people who are just coming into it that it's okay. This is going to be horrible, but it's going to be okay. There's a horror of the unknown. And so it helps reduce some of that fear that comes from uncertainty. At least you know that your skin might burn like the worst possible sunburn during radiation. And it won't necessarily happen to you, but at least you've got like the cream in the fridge just in case it does. It's that kind of thing. So you're prepared. Yeah, but one of my biggest concerns when I was diagnosed, because there's no family history, no aunts or uncles or anything, no cancer at all really in the family. One of my big concerns was my sister and my 2 nieces. She has 2 little girls. And I was horrified to think that there might be a genetic reason for it. And this doesn't make any sense logically, but that I might have brought that genetic marker into the family, even though that's not how genetics works. And so I had the genetic testing to see if there were any of the genetic markers. And my sister is now on a raised awareness, heightened scrutiny back in the UK. But fortunately, there wasn't anything. But that would have made it so much worse if I thought that somehow by being diagnosed, I'd made it more likely for my nieces or something. That would have just been awful. But it just goes to show, don't skip those routine checks for things. And I'm now the first one, when Kaiser sends me an email, I'm the first one replying, going, yep, right. What do I need to do? Let's book an appointment.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that was such a hard thing to go through. Is there anything else about your family that you would like to share or your past?
So, one of the things that I've been exploring more recently is the idea of using quilting to help as a kind of art therapy. From one perspective, I had a very happy childhood, lots of sunshine and sea, and not so much sand as pebbles, but still. But on the other hand, I also had quite a lot of trauma in my childhood, which has resulted in me getting a complex PTSD diagnosis just a couple of years ago. And so it's interesting kind of looking back at a childhood after therapy and after realizing the damage that was done, and also using quilting to explore that as well. I've had, as a result of the trauma, I've had a long history of mental illness, and I've had to always cope with depression and anxiety just as a minimum. So it always amazes me, like, you never really know the burden that someone else is carrying until you start talking to them about what's going on. And it can seem like someone's had like this ideal experience and this perfect life. And actually, you just look under the surface and there's so much going on. And that's why I love podcasts like this, where you're talking to people and finding out what's going on underneath. But also things like reading biographies and autobiographies of artists. I'm halfway through one on Gerhard Richter at the moment. It's a German artist. And yeah, it just informs the work so much. It's really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. Thinking of future generations, how do you think people will look back and describe you?
When I was working at Shopify, there was one of the teams where at the start of a new project, they would choose a fictional character from books or from anime or whatever. And they invited me to join one time. And I chose Mad Madam Mim from, I think, The Sorcerer and the Stone is the one that it's the Disney that it's from. That is kind of how I view myself. And Mad Madam Mim, for anyone not familiar with this amazing lady, she is a witch and she can change her appearance to a dragon, make herself beautiful, make herself look like she actually does, which is not great. But she's always these pink and purple colors, a bit like the Cheshire Cat. And so I kind of feel that future generations will look at me as a bit of a mad madam. I've been quite a feminist my whole life, and I've kind of gone through waves of it, and I'm becoming quite positively militant again now with the administration and so on. But I've not always chosen the easy path or stayed quiet. In fact, the sign I held at the recent Women's March earlier in January said, "I'm not going to stay quiet so that you can stay comfortable." It's kind of been that thing. It would have been easier just to say nothing most of the time. But I've always been terribly irritated by, for instance, the difference in the amount men and women earn on average in this country, which is 87 cents women earn for every dollar a man earns. And that has hardly changed in the last 20 years, which is ridiculous. But anyway, it's even worse if you're a Black or Hispanic woman. So yes, I hope that I'll be viewed as like pushed for a better world. But I think my two nieces at the moment are 5 and 11. And I know that my sister talks to them about what I get up to, and they just put it down as Auntie B's weird, just Auntie B being weird, like moving to America and making quilts. It's like, who does that? So I think I'll probably be remembered as one of those slightly strange women that pop up from time to time. And in fact, I hadn't thought about this actually. It just popped into my head. There's a British quilter called Lucy Boston who was making quilts during the 20th century and during the early part. And she was English paper piecer, which I've always loved. It was my intro to quilting was through English paper piecing. And she made a famous quilt called the Patchwork Crosses, which I've made a version of. But she left an abusive relationship and took her children and set up house by herself and wore trousers when it wasn't the done thing and supported herself. And so if I'm lucky, I might be viewed as that kind of crazy lady more than the Mad Madam Mim crazy lady.
It's great to be you.
Yeah, it really is. It's been a tough journey getting here. Some listeners might realize that I was using my birth name, Alex Byrne, up until about a year ago. And as part of all the therapy, I just realized that I'd never connected with the name Alex. It always sounded like it must be talking about someone else. So a year ago, it suddenly struck me that I didn't need to keep the name. I was making so many other changes in my life. I could also change my name. So I chose the name Bea. And I do genuinely feel like Bea is having a much better time than Alex ever did. So yeah, I feel like I've really worked for it. But yeah, happiness is now part of my life.
Now, the second part of that question is, if you could tell future generations something, what would you want to tell them?
I think there's two things. One is that your voice counts. Even if it's the quietest, tiniest little voice, then your thoughts, your feelings, your opinions, whether it's in relationships and the feelings you have around a partner or a situation, or the thoughts you have about climate change or something, or where you invest your money or where you work, it all counts. And even if you're not someone that will argue with the patriarchy, as we all should, then that's okay. And you can still do whatever thing you do, and it still counts. The flip side of that is that I feel like as individuals, we've been made to feel responsible for things like climate change and, I don't know, gender gaps and things like that. Whereas actually, it's always the authorities and the big companies that know already that these things are a problem. For instance, you can imagine if Amazon decided to never use plastic packaging again, it would make a huge impact much more of an impact on the environment than us filling up our recycling bins every other week. Or if some of the big grocers stores stopped individually packaging eggs or whatever it is they do and just were a bit more thoughtful, then it would make so much of a difference. It's not always our responsibility. The whole carbon footprint thing was a marketing concept invented to make the consumer feel responsible for carbon emissions and so on. Yes, we can do our own thing and everything we do counts, but don't forget to hold the big guy accountable at the end of it all. I will say it's worth checking whether your local authority will recycle textiles just on the quilting side, because I know San Francisco does. Just like 3 miles across the bridge in Oakland, we're in the Alameda region, and they don't. So don't ask me the logic behind that one. But yes, you can always recycle textile scraps in some way or another, even if you have to drive a few miles to do it.
I just sent my daughter-in-law a link to a place over in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's not necessarily recycling, but there's a lot of little things we have that we just throw away, like beads or crafting supplies or fabric or markers that we're just not using anymore, but they're still good. And this place takes them and people can fill up a bag and pay X amount, like $1 or $5, depending on the size of the bag. I thought it was a great way to recycle.
Yeah, in fact, there's two places. One in San Francisco is called Scrap, capital letters, and it's in Bayview. So it's not the nicest, most visited place in San Francisco, but it's very accessible in the roads. And they do an astonishing job with exactly that, diverting things from landfill. And then there's also one in Oakland in Piedmont, which is called the Creative Reuse Center, where I am a frequent flyer. And it's just astonishing. You can get like a grocery bag of fabric for, I don't know, $5 or something. And they have huge discounts or free supplies for teachers. But yes, I'm often there, as often donating as I am picking up.
That's wonderful. Those places are great. Now, besides quilting, are there other crafts that you do or have done in the past?
Yes, I am an omnicrafter. Some people are omnivores, and I am an omnicrafter. I actually started with sewing and then quickly, by the age of about 7, had gone into knitting. And it wasn't then until my 20s that I learned how to crochet, but by then I'd gone back to sewing. But in between, I had tried out pretty much every craft you can think of, including woodwork and metalwork as well, I guess, and plastic formations, like using a vacuum former. I was lucky I had a very active crafts and design department at the school that I went to between 11 and 16. And so I got the chance to do a lot of things there. And then I also subscribed to this weekly part work series called Creative Hands, which was in the UK in the 90s. And I hate to think the amount of money my mum must have spent on buying me these magazines, but they had a different craft per week. And I've always been one of those people that will just try something with no knowledge of how it's properly supposed to work, or like very little concern for the outcome. And so now I have to tell myself that I don't want to start new crafts because I don't have the time or the space or the money to acquire additional stash. For instance, I actually would secretly love to do more weaving, but I'm not letting myself. I refuse to allow it. I had to tell myself that I didn't need to card and spin my own fibers for knitting, even though I went through a spinning phase, both with a drop spindle and a spinning wheel. Yeah, my main crafts now are definitely quilting is my key one. I'm still a keen knitter and crocheter, but I also teach classes in San Francisco. There's a place called Workshop SF on Haight Street. And I teach classes in UV resin, which is like epoxy resin, except that you can use it indoors and it only takes minutes to cure rather than days. And then also I teach a couple of different types of dyeing, shibori, which is the traditional Japanese indigo dyeing, and then also natural bundle dyeing, which ties in with my trip to Peru. There's a bug called a cochineal bug, lives its whole life on the back of cactuses. There's kind of large paddle cactuses with the flat leaves and the huge spikes. In this country, of course, you would buy it and they're already dead and dried and so on. And each bug is like the head of a pin, they're tiny little things. But they create this beautiful and very vibrant red, kind of reddish purple. And one bug gives a staggering amount of color. And so when I'm doing this natural bundle dyeing class, we're using these cochineal bugs as well as onion skins and turmeric and safflower and things like that. But when I was in Peru, I actually saw these bugs in the wild growing on the backs of cactuses just on the side of the road. So it was a kind of fascinating tie-in. So yes, I am generally happy to turn my hand to pretty much any craft that you can think of. And in fact, I'm teaching a Japanese braiding workshop, kumihimo, I think it's called. I might have mispronounced that, at the end of this month in San Francisco as part of an initiative to try and attract people back to Market Street in the center of the city, which has lost a lot of its foot traffic just from people not working in the offices there and a lot of drug-related issues, fentanyl and so on, that have moved into the center of the city. So that's really interesting to get involved with those kind of projects as well.
You mentioned braiding. What are you braiding?
We're just going to use embroidery floss. It's a very minimalist craft, really. So you need embroidery floss and then a circle of cardboard with some notches cut in it with some paper scissors, and off you go. So it's ideal for like a Girl Scout activity or a school class or something, because you just hardly need anything and people can just get on with it at their own pace. And it's ideal for this event, which is about bringing people into the city, because it's not something you would complete in 5 minutes. So they're very much incentivized to buy a drink from the venue that it's being held with, and then maybe get a snack or two, and then stay in the bar for an hour or so doing this braiding. So yeah, it's great fun.
That is a fun one. I did make a circle out of the cardboard and use my floss. So that's one I have done, and it is fun.
I know. And there's so many variations on it. The basic one that I'm going to be doing, I think you only need to have 8 notches or maybe 12 notches in the cardboard, but you can get kumihimo discs that have got, I think it's 36 notches in them, and you can make some incredibly elaborate braids and cords with this thing. But yes, I'm just going to be doing an introductory level one.
That would be fun. How about other hobbies?
So I think most of my hobbies are craft related. So I am generally always making something. I do end up watching a lot of television, but I actually feel that the television is just to give me something to watch while I'm sewing or knitting. And recently I've got more into European detective shows. So all the ones in like French and German. I'm watching one at the moment, which has got this ridiculous name, The Sniffer. It's a man that solves crimes by smelling, which I just think is hilarious. And I think it might be Russian, but it's definitely an Eastern European language. And of course, they've all got subtitles. My languages aren't that good. I have enough French to understand when they're not translating what's actually been said in the subtitles. But certainly my Russian wouldn't get me more than a hello. So yeah, it's fascinating to see how different different cultures approach the same kind of murder mystery format. But I consider it, and I think this might be part of my ADHD, but I consider it a kind of waste of time just to watch television. And I need to be doing something with my hands while it's going on. So it's either knitting or English paper piecing, which is so useful because you're working in such small blocks all the time.
Mm-hmm. Who introduced you to quilting?
Oh, it was my mother who taught me how to sew. So a lot of my sewing to begin with was making the quintessential jumper and tops and things for teddy bears and stuff like that, or little pouches that never held anything securely inside them. And then I went on to cross stitch because I kind of see it as such a no-brainer. If you like maths and numbers, cross stitch is the perfect craft for you because it's all on a grid, and would do quite a lot of that as a younger child. But then I found a bag, like a grocery bag, in our airing cupboard, which firmly surrounded our boiler at home, as all good UK houses have one. It was full of these brown and white hexagons. I was fascinated by the hexagons themselves because they had the paper inside, and it was all these 70s psychedelic magazines, cutouts had been cut into these hexagon shapes. And apparently my mum had started this sometime before I was conceived. And like every quilter, it was now stewing and mellowing in this airing cupboard with the bag disintegrating around it. I expect the fabrics would have been polyester as well if I had known enough to think about it, thinking of the time. This is the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. So I was fascinated by this and asked about it. And she explained to me what it was and how it worked. So I went off and drew my own hexagon, which of course wasn't a hexagon at all. It was completely misshapen, but then made multiple cutouts of it and started sewing them together. So I made some very lumpy pincushions. That was my thing. I would do a grandmother's flower garden rosette and do one for the top and one for the bottom and sew them together. I actually had some of them until recently, and I was thinking about this the other day. I'm hoping there's a photo of them somewhere. But yeah, it wasn't until I was in my teens, and I'm sure I'm just like every other teenager. So I would get pocket money and I would go off and buy sewing magazines, just like every teenager does. So it was one of these craft magazines that had all sorts of different craft projects in it, and one of which was a baby's quilt. And it had these cool, I feel like they were either scarecrows or clowns. And then it had some teddy bear fabric, I remember, in kind of corner blocks and some sashing. And I was fascinated by this and went out and looked through the various scrap bins at the local fabric store for any oddments that I could make into it, and came back with all sorts of bits of corduroy and some lining fabric and some stretch knit and so on, nothing that was at all suitable for a quilt. And unfortunately, that was about as far as that project got. I did piece a few areas, but just hadn't got any of the right fabrics or equipment, really. And so it wasn't until I was in my probably mid-20s, maybe early 20s, I'd been knitting a lot. I was making all sorts of things, and I'd done steeking, and I'd done socks, and I'd done, I don't know, like Fair Isle and color knitting and all cabling. I basically felt like I'd done knitting. All my family were begging me not to give them any more jumpers or hats or socks or scarves because they were all had enough. And yeah, I was kind of looking for a new challenge. And it was when Pinterest had just launched, and I saw a quilt pattern on there. And I still have the quilt to this day. It's like my sofa quilt outside. It was actually too complicated for a beginner, which I always think is a great blessing when you don't know that at the time. But it was a bullseye, a center circle that was a solid, and then 2 rows of pieced circles around it. And there were, I think, 12 of these targets on the quilts. And I separated them with sashing and used a kind of polycotton purple and white polka dot for that, and then backed it. But at the time, I didn't know that the meaning of a quilt was that you had like a top, a batting, and a backing, and you were stitching through all the layers. So at the same time, I was making this English paper pieced like rainbow quilt. And I thought that the quilting, this is so silly, honestly. I thought that the quilting was just a stitched design on the top. So I had got the top and put it under my sewing machine and started quilting on top of it without any layers or anything underneath it, just on the top. Unfortunately, realized my error before trying to quilt this one with the circles on it. Even so, they're only quilted around the middle of the targets. And it's, of course, it's a polyester batting, 100% polyester batting, because I had no idea what I was doing. And I'm sure you're probably supposed to quilt it like 4 inches apart or something. And these ones are quilted about 10 inches apart. So it's going to crumble at some point and turn into dust. But still, I'm very fond of it. My cat will not sit on my lap unless this particular quilt is on my lap. So she's very particular. And so we gladly snuggle underneath it most evenings, although it is quite problematic in the summer.
It is so funny how our pets can get their thoughts across to us without using our language.
Oh, my goodness, yes. My cat, Charlotte, she's now, I think, 10 years old, because it was a bit unclear when I first got her, but she was a former feral and was at least a year old and had already had kittens by the time I adopted her. She only has one eye, but she is so communicative. Well, she's shouting at me from the other room right now because she thinks it's time for her treats. But she just has these different little actions that she'll do that will indicate exactly what it is she wants. And when she's annoyed, I can tell from the way she's moving her tail, and she's having a little hissy fit. And yeah, she's absolutely adorable. I absolutely love that cat. I always say she's my primary partner, my significant other.
Whether it's a quilt you made or someone else made, do you have a favorite quilt?
I think the one that I've made that I've probably got the most out of was the Lucy Boston Patchwork of the Crosses copy that I made, the woman that I was talking about earlier. And I took part in a bee with people all over the world, which turned out to be particularly useful because it started just as I moved from the UK to Japan. So I think I got sent my first blocks from the UK. I then received blocks in Japan and then was mailing the last blocks by the time I'd moved to the US. It was a kind of project that spanned about 2 years. And it was so rewarding to make these blocks for other people and to see their colorways and to imagine what their quilts were going to look like and then actually see the finished quilts afterwards. It was one of the first ones that I ever entered into a show when I moved to San Francisco. And I actually won a judge's choice ribbon, which I was extremely proud of. Is something I talk about in one of the lectures that I give. Yeah, so that quilt means a lot to me, but probably the one that kind of springs to mind immediately is the one that I'm going to share a photo of with you, which is a triptych that I made last summer. I think I finished it in time for the Pacific International Quilt Festival, and it hung in the show, in the festival display. And it's 3 pieces. The middle is an English paper pieced portrait, and it uses 1-inch hexagons. So it's very pixelated if pixels were hexagonal instead of square. So it's very abstract. And then I really wanted to quilt it multiple different ways and manipulate it multiple different ways. But I didn't want to keep having to make the quilt over and over because it's, I don't know, it's probably like 4 foot by 3 foot or something. It's not insignificant thing to make. And so instead, I took a very high resolution photograph of the panel, the unquilted portrait, and then went to a fabric company to print copies of that photo onto yardage. And so the panels could only be the width of the yardage. So the panels are a little bit smaller than the original. And so I was able to take 2 of the copied panels and put one either side of the original, and to quilt the original one way and then to do completely different things to the panels on either side. So you've got 3 versions of the same quilt, which is self-portrait. And I think it was the second quilt that was part of a kind of therapy journey, because it's very clearly, once you see it, about kind of mental illness and feeling like you're broken or very tentatively held together, or there's just too much going on and too much happening. So that was really interesting. And it also meant that I was doing things like incorporating some plastic vinyl into it to kind of hold the pieces apart, and then cutting the quilt completely across its surface and bandaging it back together with safety pin and things like that. So yeah, it felt very cathartic to make that, and then see it hanging in Santa Clara at the Quilt Festival was very exciting as well.
Wow. It is exciting to see your work hanging there.
Absolutely.
So did you have the opportunity to stand back and watch other people look at it?
I always think that's a double-edged sword, because I had a quilt that I'd made earlier on and that had hung in a East Bay Heritage Quilters. It had hung in their show a few years ago because I'm a member of them, as well as the San Francisco Quilters. And I did deliberately hang around and wait to hear what people said. And I remember one woman looking at it, and it was my divorce quilt. So it was like quite angry and quite stark and kind of bitter. And it had the explanation that this was a divorce quilt and so on. And I remember one woman standing in front of it with a friend and just kind of pausing and looking around and nodding her head. And she just kind of went, yep, guess a lot of things happened there. And then just walked on. And it was like, okay, that is a good summary of my divorce and why it happened and what happened and so on. It's like, yep, there was a lot of things happened. There's nothing wrong at all with making beautiful things. And I'm all in favor of making things that bring beauty into people's lives. And there's a great William Morris quote about how you shouldn't have anything in your house that you don't consider to be either beautiful or practical. I definitely agree with that. But I've always wanted to make things that people will feel a response to, like that will make them feel or think or consider, or sometimes maybe make them feel a little bit uncomfortable. It's like the Francis Bacon paintings of the Pope. I think it's called the Screaming Pope, or there's a few versions of it. I've always found those paintings fascinating because they are horrific and deeply uncomfortable to look at, but so powerful and such a statement. But anyway, there's a lot of prize women quilts that have got all little crystals all over them and like thread painting and so on. But my quilts are generally going to be ones that will at least go on bed in a practical sense, and you can machine wash and so on, or be a piece of art that could easily or like not uncomfortably be fitted into someone's home, where you don't need a whole like California king size bed wall to display them on.
What tool do you use with your quilting that you are so grateful to have?
Without hesitation, it is a seam ripper. I am not a perfect quilter. I am not a perfectionist quilter. In fact, I sometimes think that I should just adopt the title of the close enough quilter. And that's very much how I teach. I was teaching a kaleidoscope quilt making workshop a couple of weeks ago in Sacramento. And some people are very worried about making their seams match and nest and so on. And I absolutely respect that. But if you don't, do that, then I respect that too. And I'm absolutely fine with that. My seams do not match hardly at all. So yes, a seam ripper is undoubtedly my favorite thing. And again, I think that's partly the ADHD, that I will get into a flow of making something and then realize that I sewed a piece backwards about 20 minutes ago, and I've now got to go and unpick it and resubstitute something else. And in fact, I've got a nice one. It looks a bit like a beehive. It's like some plastic eraser type thing on the top, so you can sweep away the little bits of thread after you've done the seam ripping itself. I've seen some interesting developments recently. There's one that's come out that's more like a razor. Is it Dritz? I feel like it's a German engineering thing. I'm always interested when there's technological developments in these tools that are so fundamental to quilting. And when new little things come out, like extra pointy, useful pins that have got grips on the top, or who thought to put a bend in the safety pins that we use for basting? I guess a load of people must have just bent their own safety pins to begin with, and then some bloke decided to manufacture them like that. But yes, I find that absolutely fascinating. And in fact, there is a podcast that I've been listening to recently, which goes into the history of various different crafts and kind of talks about some of these things. It's just called Handmade History. I don't know if you've ever seen those little, and I'm going to say this wrong, amigurumi, little crocheted cute things with great big eyes. I had no idea that those resulted from the devastation of the Second World War. That is where those come from originally. I was kind of really taken aback, and I'm not going to be able to look at them in the same way anymore, knowing that. Yeah, this Handmade History podcast is fascinating.
Oh, that does. I have to look that one up. Well, while you're making a quilt, there are so many steps. Do you look forward to a specific step while you're quilting, or do you like each step along the way?
So I think I really like the design stage. And sometimes I kind of get stuck at that stage. I wrote about this in a newsletter I sent out a couple of months ago. I feel like once I've designed it in my head and I've identified the fabrics, there's almost no point in actually making it, because it's in my head, it's already made. So I should just move on to the next bit. But then I get frustrated because I've got 20 quilts designed in my head, but haven't actually made them all. And then it can feel like the making is the boring bit. Whereas actually, once I get into the flow of sewing, I love sewing. It's one of my huge pleasures in life, hand sewing and machine sewing. So I would say the designing was my favorite, but I do like the piecing as well. What I don't enjoy so much is the quilting, which is mainly because I lack experience in doing that. In fact, one of the teachers from the event I ran recently, who's from the Silly Moon Quilting Company, Kelly, her name is, she just sent me some rulers, which is so nice of her. And so I'm going to try ruler quilting for the first time later this week, which I think might make a difference in how I approach my quilting. Yes, I guess the quilting is probably my least favorite bit, but that's not saying a lot because I really do enjoy pretty much all of it. I don't mind sewing binding down by hand or basting. It means I have to crawl around on my living room floor because I don't have a table big enough, but I don't mind doing any of these things. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with the whole lot.
You mentioned the ruler quilting. So do you have a long arm, or do you do that on your domestic machine somehow?
On a domestic, yes. In fact, I've talked to a lot of quilters about this. I'm one of those people who is always wondering whether they should get a long arm or a handy quilter or something. And I am fascinated by when people decide, like, what the tipping point is for people to take the plunge and get a long arm. I am, fortunately for my own bank balance, held back because I'm in a 1-bedroom rental and I do not have room. I barely have room for a second sewing machine, never mind a long arm. But I am always looking at these big sewing frames, and I've been able to use one from time to time, and I've learned how to do it and how to load the quilt and so on. Yeah, I just think they're fantastic, those machines. But no, going back to your question, it's all on the domestic. I have a Janome, I think it's a 2300 maybe. It's got a larger throat so that you can have a rolled up quilt inside it. It's not a really huge throat, but it's bigger than your average domestic. It's got all sorts of different feet and stitches and things that you can do, and you can monogram and so on it. So yes, I've had it for about 6 years now, and I'm really happy with it.
Nice. It is nice to have the extra room on your sewing machine.
Definitely. And it's also, I got one of those extension tables as well, which does make it so much easier when you're quilting something. It just reduces the drag and the resistance.
Mm-hmm. Describe your worst quilting experience.
And obviously, there's the one where I was just stitching on top of the top rather than through all the layers because I had no idea what I was doing. But the worst things have been when it affects other people. So, for instance, like a lot of guilds, the San Francisco Guild made an opportunity quilt while I was president. And as president, I was given the honor of making the middle block of this quilt, the eye-catching center. And there was this wonderful member called Sylvie who was coordinating everything. And I made the block and I gave it to her. I didn't realize until later, but what she must have done, she either unpicked everything and resewed it or must have made a whole new one, because my 1/4 inch seams, because I am not a precision person, my 1/4 inch seams were not 1/4 inch seams. And because this was a pieced top, all the blocks had to have the same seam allowance, otherwise they weren't going to match up. And I only realized months later, and I just felt so bad and was very apologetic because I realized that I had caused her more work by trying to make this middle block. Now, of course, since I've learned my lesson, and when it's very important that it's a 1/4 inch seam, I will have a piece of tape on the thing and use the 1/4 inch foot and all that sort of thing and take much more care. But I did feel terribly guilty then. A similar experience very early on when I hadn't brought my walking foot to a community sewing event where we were making quilts for either premature babies or homeless youths or something like that. And someone had made this really pretty top for a lap quilt. And my job was to quilt it, but without the walking foot, of course, the stitches were all going and the puckering and distorting, and it just wasn't looking good. And I felt very bad that someone had made this really great top and that I was making it look not as good as it should have done by puckering the stitching and just trying to use a normal everyday foot with it. I think now I definitely would just hold up my hands and say, I can't do this because I haven't got the right equipment. Give me something else to do. But yes, I persevered thinking that it must get done when probably I shouldn't have. So yes, those definitely.
Yeah. We do want to get things done, and sometimes that pushes us in the wrong way.
I know. And it's often so easy where people have like meant for the best and done their best and wanted everything to work out well. But actually, it would have been better if you just stuck your hand up 10 minutes earlier and said, can you repeat that? Or something along those lines.
So why do you think you continue to make quilts rather than spend your time doing anything else?
It's a really interesting question because going back to what I said earlier about feeling that quilts need to be usable or art to be hung on the wall, I have now got a lot of quilts in my closets because I take them around places when I do lectures and teach workshops and so on. So there is some justification for keeping hold of them, but equally, I'm sure there's a good half dozen that I could donate and would be of more use to someone else. And I have also got to the point where my family have said, please, God, no more quilts. So I intend to obviously start making pillows and quilted jackets and so on, just to further supplement their quilts. I think anyone who has something that they feel then they need to say with art or in any creative form just feels this compulsion to keep going. There's a British artist called Tracy Emin, who was one of the kind of Britpop artists who were very popular in the 90s, along with Damien Hirst. And she's had a hell of a life. And a few years ago went through bowel cancer and had like a bag inserted and has had all sorts of complications. And she continues painting. And even if she's just painting her cats, she's still going and she's still got more to say. I've read a quote somewhere about how she would continue even if the canvases just stacked up in the studio. No one was interested at all. She would just keep going. So I guess it's that I have more to say or more to express. And I do sometimes feel like it is a case of like a pressure release rather than letting go of something necessarily. I think if you're lucky and really work hard at therapy, you can let go of things. And I have done a lot of that. But then I think in the meantime, there needs to be a pressure release. So I also think that it's a good way to release pressure. But also they make great gifts. What baby shower or wedding is complete without a quilt?
That leads me into, who do you make your quilts for?
So it has tended to be friends and family. And early on, I would always knit blankets for babies and knit little cardigans and hats and so on. And now it does tend to be quilts, although fortunately for everyone, most of my friends have stopped having children at this point. So that's a bonus. But now I'm making quilts at this point in growing my kind of quilting professional side. I tend to be making quilts as examples or samples or to kind of illustrate something. For instance, I just this morning started a series of quilts inspired by Peru. And I was just working out because I had a list of about a dozen different ideas and had sketched them out and so on. And I narrowed it down to 5 or 6 that I'm going to actually go ahead with. And I ordered the fabric this morning because the place near me doesn't have what I need. So the quilts that I make now are out of necessity, or I will always generally have a charity project on the go for the SF Guild. So I just finished a lap quilt where someone else had made the top and I was basting and binding and quilting. I've always been very driven to always be giving back to the community somehow. And I think it's a fundamental part of being human is to help those that are less fortunate than yourselves, whether they're less fortunate because they're unhoused and living on the streets, or whether they're less fortunate because they don't know how to quilt. Either of those situations. So yeah, I always have a charity quilt on the go. But what I'm moving more into now is making extra time for creativity. And to me, that looks like not a series of 6 quilts inspired by a trip to Peru that I know that I'm going to be using to illustrate a lecture that I'll start giving once I've actually made them in the summer. But it's more about like this therapy-based expression and pressure release and letting things go and pieces that make people feel something, like the triptych that I finished last summer.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a quilting tip that you like to give?
One of the tips that I gave in my kaleidoscope class a few weeks ago was that you can really do a lot with something like painter's tape or masking tape, like a low tack tape. And you don't need to actually cut or fold the fabric to see what something is going to look like. You can create a frame of painter's tape around the square that you're thinking of using and lay it alongside other things. They always say measure twice, cut once. Although I once famously made a pyrography, like a wood burning thing, but accidentally said measure once, cut twice. Which I still have on my wall because I think it's the perfect warning to anyone who has ADHD or is a bit over keen sometimes. But yeah, you don't need to jump into cutting, even if you have measured it multiple times, or just mask it out using a piece of paper. The other thing I really love in this era of modern phones is that you can use the filters on your phones to give you that look at what value things are, by turning it into black and white and seeing which ones really stand out. So yeah, those would be 2 that I would suggest to everyone.
Yeah, those are great tips. I always think of the quilt I made with my mother, and I went to make the borders. I kept measuring wrong and cutting it. I ended up putting cornerstones on the corners because I kept cutting it just the length of the quilt and not the length plus the other borders. But it made a very unique quilt, and I really like it that way.
Absolutely. It's not the end of the world when things like that happen. I just had to do exactly the same thing. I made a kaleidoscope quilt using this Alexander Henry print of very hunky men around the campfire. It was absolutely ridiculous. I was going to put a thick border around the outside of this other fabric, didn't have enough, and ended up putting in corners, which hadn't been planned, but fortunately worked out that there was enough of the other one. It's just one of those things, there's a woman who wrote the Improv Quilting Handbook, and she always says that when you make a mistake, you should shout out, whoopee, and move on, because it just had the opportunity to try something new that you wouldn't have otherwise had.
Yeah. Share how you went from having quilting as your hobby and it became a business for you.
Yes. So I will take you back about 2.5 years. Tech had been booming and everything was wonderful. And then there was a bit of a stock market crash, and then all these tech layoffs started. And of course, San Francisco, Silicon Valley were very strongly affected because salaries are so much higher in this area. I'd been working for a tech company called Shopify, which is not Spotify, easily confused. But Shopify is something that if people run an online store, they'll probably have heard from, because you can use it to set up an online store, amongst other things. And I'd been working for them for almost 5 years. And within a few months, there were 2 rounds of layoffs. I survived the first round, but was very uncomfortable working at the business and kind of lost all my confidence in what we were doing and how things were going and developing. And so when I got caught in the second round of layoffs, it was a huge relief, and they gave us a generous payoff. So I was able to take that money. I did take a month off because I was quite burnt out by that point. But then I was able to start throwing different ideas around and trying different things. So my initial idea was that I was going to make quilt labels that people would iron onto their quilts. And I quickly discovered that people didn't want quilt labels that ironed onto their quilts. So I tried a few other things with quilt labels, and it wasn't really going anywhere. So then I started teaching craft classes in San Francisco, and was teaching all sorts of different classes, and was also teaching at libraries and things like that. And then towards the end of the year, I found out about an online summit, like an online stitching summit by a company in either Australia or New Zealand called Zen Stitching. The owner does a lot of mindful stitching and sashiko. It was really nice. And there was a free version. And then if you paid extra, you got longer to watch the workshops. And you also got all these additional bits and bobs that you could download and access online. And I thought, wow, this is such a great format. And I started noticing that there were also ones for people that were into card making, or specifically people that owned those cry-cut cutting machines. And I started noticing them for a few other crafts. And I was Googling, trying to find one for quilting, and didn't come across anything at the time. I now know that there were a couple of small, like scrap specific ones, and a few, like one machine quilting specific one. Couldn't find anything. I've always been one of these people where if I want to go like to a trampoline park, for example, in fact, I should have done this, then I will organize a trip to a trampoline park and be the organizer on behalf of a group of friends that then end up going. I guess I just don't know that many people that would want to go to a trampoline park. But anyway, I was confident that I knew enough people that would be interested in an online summit for quilting, or at least that I could get in touch with enough people, because I knew from my work at Shopify quite a lot about meta advertising on Facebook and Instagram, search engine optimization, that kind of thing, like all the tech side of things. And so I very foolishly, not realizing how hard it was going to be, just like my first quilt, was like, well, I'm having a summit. And I invited a few people. Mel Beach was one of them, of course, the person who told me about this podcast. And Joe Cunningham, a whole load of other people, some of whom have been with me through the second and third summits as well. Then after much, much, much work, there were 30 teachers from around the world teaching 30 different workshops. And there were all sorts of bonuses to be had by people that signed up, both for free people and for VIPs as well, who paid for the all access pass. And since then, I've had two more, one in July last year, that was summer camp, and then another one in January this year, just a few weeks ago. And it's been absolutely fascinating. And I've had the chance to meet so many teachers around the world, and there's so many attendees as well. It's blown up my mailing list. So now I've got this audience that are keen to learn and keen to find out new things and access different bits and bobs. So I've got a twice a month newsletter that goes out to all of them. And at the same time, I was signing up with places like the Northern California Quilt Council, NCQC, is how a lot of local guilds find the teachers that will then give lectures and do workshops for them. And since then, I've signed up with a couple of organizations that go more broadly than California as well. So I was growing the teaching and lecturing side of things as well. And I'd always done a certain amount of public speaking and online learning as part of my jobs, not so much in the US, but more in the UK. It kind of, again, it felt fortunate that I'd been laid off, even though, of course, it was very disturbing because I'm a single income household. It's not like I've got a partner that can help me with the rent or something. And my cat is quite against helping. I actually, in fact, at an earlier time, had an idea that I would sell cat beds online. This was some years ago. And Charlotte point blank refused to sit in any of the cat beds that I was trying to sell, which I thought was absolutely outrageous. Her first chance to actually contribute to the household income. And she was not into it at all. So anyway, I was able to grow my own presence as a teacher and lecturer at the same time as growing these events, which started off being called Quilt 2024, which in retrospect was a time-limited name. Then I rebranded in the summer to Quilt and Learn. So now they're at quiltandlearn.com. And the one coming up next in July is going to be the Tour de Fabric, because the spinners and the knitters have had the Tour de Fleece for more than a decade. And again, I was looking up to thinking there must be a Tour de Fabric. This must be a thing. I can't be the first person to have thought of this. The Tour de France being the fourth most watched sporting event in the world, while the Super Bowl is only like 8 or 9. And there wasn't anything, so I'm doing it now. So it's going to be a summit in July called the Tour de Fabric.
Oh, how fun. I was so thrilled to see your list of teachers, and several of them had already been on my podcast, so that was exciting to see familiar faces.
That's great minds thinking alike. I've been really fortunate with the teachers because often teachers who came on like the first or second event will then recommend to friends of theirs and contacts that they get in touch. I collect data from the teachers afterwards on like how many people they grew their email list by, for example, which is such a vital thing for anyone who's teaching or selling or lecturing. And it is significant how much of a bump it gives the teachers, hundreds of people, if not more, signing up for their email newsletters, and their website traffic jumps during the event, and they just get so much more name recognition because there'll be more than 5,000 people signing up for each event. So it's a lot of people looking at those names.
Wow. It sounds like it really snowballed.
Yeah, I was amazed. I was aiming for 2,000 people for the first event and went almost 4 times that and was blown away. I am guilty, like a lot of people, of just putting it down to luck, but actually it was research and planning. I had invested additional money in a platform that would be able to cope with that quantity of people, because you can imagine all those people logging in at once. If you try and run an event like that on WordPress, unless you're very technical and have got everything set up in the back end, the website's just going to crash. Whereas the platform that I still use to this day is set up for those companies that are doing $1 million launches. And so the website doesn't crash when 7,000 quilters from around the world suddenly try and log on and start watching a workshop.
I can't even picture 7,000 quilters heading to one place at the same time.
It is wonderful because you know that you're surrounded by your people. These are all people that you don't have to explain what a seam ripper is and why it's such a vital part of your life. and why it's important that you have 27 shades of green in your stack. So it's, this is your community.
Yep, everyone should know those things.
Yeah.
So is your business called Quilt and Learn, or is that just part of your business?
I do have a slight crisis of identity here at the moment because my main outward facing business is called Quilt and Learn, and that's quilt letter N learn.com is the website. But then I tend to just use Bea Byrne, my name, when I'm doing the lecturing and teaching and so on. And in fact, I'm about to set up a store to start selling products. I was speaking at a guild recently, and they were very disappointed that I hadn't brought anything to sell. I was kind of thinking to myself, I am leaving money on the table here. You know, these people want to buy something, and I really got to do something about that. So yeah, I am about to set up a store. So that's why I've been considering whether to have an umbrella name for the whole business, like the Close Enough Quilter or something like that, or whether to just go with Bea Byrne still and just keep it simple. So it's either Bea Byrne, or for the event specifically, it's Quilt and Learn.
Great. Thinking back to your first workshop that you had and people started signing up, explain the excitement that you had.
I don't know if it was excitement so much as disbelief. The very first workshop I taught was a knitting workshop. And I used to organize these knitting retreats with a friend back in the UK. And we would go up north to a place called Haworth, which is where the Bronte sisters were from, and stay in a kind of upmarket youth hostel and visit all the local knitting stores, of which there were many. And I taught a knitting workshop as part of this. And I was thinking to myself at the time, these people know me. They've seen me knit and stuff. But now they're actually paying attention to what I'm saying, even though surely they know that I only know as much as they do. You know, there's very little difference between what I knew and what they knew. I just guess I knew enough to feel confident about teaching this particular workshop. And it is definitely, there's a moment of wonder at the beginning of any event like that when the sign-ups start, and also a big moment of imposter syndrome. I can't believe anyone actually wants to listen to me. There's just that moment of doubt. And then I remember, it's okay. You've done this before. This is going to go fine. You know, you get great feedback. You're good at this. People are going to have the opportunity to expand themselves in some way, like gain a skill or learn something new or be inspired. I do get a kick out of enabling others to do something that they couldn't do before. And I think that's why, certainly back in the UK, I was always very involved in the training and development field, because helping other people, that stereotypical pleaser part of a lot of people, especially those that have had trauma in their childhood. And that definitely is an intrinsic part of me, that I just want to help people live happier lives.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's fun getting together with other quilters.
Oh, absolutely. It's endlessly inspiring. And in fact, I find this in every class I teach, whether it's UV resin or quilting. You give people basically the same materials and the same set of instructions, and they go off in madly different directions with it. And I absolutely love that. I couldn't teach something where everyone started with the same fabric and then they made this cut and then they made that cut. No, that's not me. There are people that do that, and that's awesome. And it teaches valuable lessons, and I'm not knocking it. But I love seeing the sheer randomness of what comes out.
Mm-hmm. Are all of your classes online?
No, there is one class that's online at the moment, which is Fabric Weaving 101, which is a class I taught at the summer camp event. But I am always encouraging other teachers to record their workshops for my events, and then get so busy dealing with those that I don't record my own workshops. So I've got a huge long list of workshops that I keep meaning to record, whether it's things that I teach or whether it's just like little 5-minute things that kind of stand as a sampler of what I teach to encourage people to sign up for a workshop. I need to put time aside for this. I think, again, it's a challenge. The ADHD mind takes people in different ways. But one of the things I am definitely struggling with is that everything takes a lot longer than I think it's going to. So I will put aside a day to record a workshop and then end up answering email until 11:30. And then someone comes in suggesting some event in the future, and suddenly I'm researching hotels and flights, and it's 2:00 and I've forgotten to eat lunch, and I've only got 2 hours left before the daylight fades to record the workshop, and I haven't written the script yet. So I am terrible like that and just get overwhelmed with different things. But one day I will get them online. But in the meantime, if you go to beabyrne.com, then there is a list of all the lectures and workshops that I can deliver. And there's a lot, in fact, most of them can be done on Zoom. There's only a couple that have to be in person, like the UV resin one, for example, where you need the actual materials in front of you and the lamps and so on.
Is there anything else about your business that we missed and you wanted to share?
One of the things that I really enjoy as a self-employed entrepreneur, as I think of myself now, which is very exciting to think of yourself as an entrepreneur, is the flexibility. So I'm constantly thinking of new ideas. For example, I was thinking about making a quilter's affirmation deck, because you see a lot of affirmation cards nowadays. And I was thinking about how this could apply to quilters. And there are some creative ones out there, but not the specific niche of quilting. So, of course, the next thing I know, I've got a Pinterest board with 100 pins on it, and I'm way down the rabbit hole. But I'm not prioritizing that right now because I'm prioritizing making and recording workshops. But maybe in 6 months, I've got the flexibility to come back to that and go back to working out the design I can handle, but it's the manufacture of that kind of thing and the distribution. And in the meantime, I might bump into, like, I'm going to QuiltCon for the first time in a few weeks, and maybe I'll bump into someone who makes card decks while I'm networking or something, or in one of the lectures, and suddenly I'll have the perfect contact to develop this new product. So I really do enjoy the flexibility of it.
You shared earlier your website, but go ahead and share it again.
Absolutely. The events that I run twice a year are quiltnlearn.com, quilt and learn with a little letter N between the quilt and the learn. And then my personal website is beabyrne.com, BeaByrne.com. And you can also find me on Instagram and Facebook as Bea Byrne Artist, on the basis of fake it till you make it. I will be an artist anytime now, or I am an artist, but other people will start thinking I'm an artist anytime.
Well, that's great. Bea, thank you so much for sharing your story with us on A Quilter's Life. It was wonderful hearing what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Paula. I love the podcast, and this has been an honor to be on it.
Well, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You can find more stories on aquilterslife.com or subscribe on your favorite podcast player so each episode will be downloaded automatically. Also, I want to hear about you and your wonderful quilts. Please contact me, Paula Chamberlain, through the website to set up an interview. And as always, thanks for listening.